This is a story of a famous butcher that have the most sales in the market. People come to only his stock to buy meat, leaving other butchers behind without knowing the true source of his meat. Stay till the end. In a bustling city where people hurried through their daily routines, there stood a small butcher shop at the corner of a crowded marketplace. The shop, known for its tender and flavorful meats, was always filled with customers who swore by the quality of the cuts. No one questioned where the meat came from, and no one ever wondered why the prices were slightly cheaper than the other butchers around. The owner of the shop, a man named Elias, had been in the business for years. His hands were skilled with a blade, and his knowledge of meat was unmatched. He knew how to cut it just right, how to season it so the taste was addictive, and how to keep customers coming back for more. But behind his welcoming smile and the friendly chatter he shared with customers, there was a dark secret buried deep within his business. Elias did not sell ordinary meat. His shop thrived on something far more sinister. Every cut, every slab, every piece wrapped in paper and handed to a customer was once part of a human body. He had perfected his craft, ensuring that no one could ever tell the difference. His customers unknowingly feasted on the flesh of the unsuspecting souls who had fallen into his trap. Running such a business required a well-orchestrated plan, and Elias did not work alone. He had a small but ruthless gang that operated with precision. Their methods were simple but effective. They would lure victims, drifters, travelers, people without family ties, offering them work, shelter, or even a drink after a long day. Once inside their grasp, the victims never saw daylight again. Elias had a special room at the back of his shop, soundproofed and cold. It was there that the real work was done. His gang worked swiftly, ensuring that the process was clean and efficient. Every part of the body had its use. The meat was carefully prepared and stored, the bones ground into dust or disposed of in places no one would think to look, and any belongings were either sold or burned. The business thrived. Customers swarmed to his shop, their mouths watering at the aroma of fresh cuts being prepared. Some even asked for special orders, wanting a particular tenderness or a unique flavor. Elias obliged with a smile, knowing exactly how to meet their demands. As the shop's reputation grew, so did the demand. More bodies were needed. Elias and his gang expanded their operations, targeting not just drifters but people who wouldn't be missed right away, lonely individuals, debt-ridden gamblers, and even the occasional arrogant businessman who thought himself too important to vanish. With each successful kill, Elias refined his process. He experimented with seasoning, aging the meat in different ways to enhance its richness. The customers never suspected a thing. They praised him, telling friends and family about the quality of his products. The shop became a landmark in the city, a place where people lined up early in the morning just to get the best cuts before they sold out. But with success came risk. The more they operated, the higher the chances of a mistake. And mistakes, Elias knew, could cost everything. Elias understood that one slip-up could bring everything crashing down. He drilled his gang on precision, no traces, no bodies left behind, no patterns that could link disappearances to the shop. They had rules, strict ones. Never take someone too close to home. Never leave behind evidence. Never get greedy. For years, these rules kept them safe. The butcher shop flourished, and Elias enjoyed the fruits of his dark labor. His gang was well paid, loyal, and feared him enough not to question his orders. But no empire lasts forever, and trouble was beginning to brew beneath the surface. One evening, as Elias locked up the shop, one of his men, Jonah, came to him with a problem. A woman had come looking for her brother, who had gone missing days ago. The brother had been one of their recent victims, a quiet, lonely man Elias had deemed perfect for their operation. The woman, however, was persistent. She had visited multiple businesses in the area, showing his picture, asking if anyone had seen him. Elias remained calm. People asked questions all the time. He assured Jonah that as long as they stuck to the plan, there was nothing to fear. He instructed his men to keep an eye on her, to follow her movements. If she got too close to the truth, they would have to handle her. But the woman was not just some concerned sister. She was smarter than Elias had anticipated. She spoke to locals, listened carefully to rumors. Whispers of disappearances, strange deliveries, and the ever-growing success of the butcher shop reached her ears. Unlike others who accepted the shop's success without question, she saw the pattern. One night, she came to the shop under the guise of a customer. She smiled, complimented the meat, asked casual questions about how Elias sourced his products. Elias, ever the professional, answered smoothly, but he could see the sharpness in her eyes. She was testing him. After she left, Elias knew she had to be dealt with. He called a meeting with his gang, outlining the plan. They would wait, observe her, and strike when the moment was right. It had to be clean. No mistakes. The next night, as the woman walked home through a dimly lit alley, they moved in. A van pulled up beside her, doors sliding open. Hands grabbed her, pulled her inside before she could scream. She fought hard, kicking, biting, scratching, but there were too many of them. They brought her to the back room of the shop, where so many had met their end. But unlike the others, she did not beg. She did not plead for her life. Instead, she stared at Elias with a steady gaze and said something that sent a chill through him. "You think no one knows," she whispered. "You think you're untouchable." Elias frowned, masking his unease. "No one's coming for you," he said coldly. The woman chuckled, despite the bruises on her face. "We'll see." Elias had seen many people die in that room, but something about her unsettled him. He ordered his men to finish the job quickly. They did, disposing of her body as they always did, ensuring no trace remained. But her words lingered in his mind long after she was gone. The following days were tense. Elias felt something he hadn't felt in years: paranoia. He watched the customers more closely, listened for any hint of suspicion. His men assured him that nothing had changed, that they had cleaned up as always. But Elias couldn't shake the feeling that a storm was coming. Then, one evening, just as he was preparing to close the shop, he noticed something strange. A man stood across the street, staring at the shop. He didn't enter, didn't move, just watched. Elias pretended not to notice, but he felt a chill crawl up his spine. The next day, the same man was there. And the next. Always watching. Elias sent Jonah to follow him, but the men disappeared into the crowded streets before he could be tailed. Something was wrong. Someone was onto them. And Elias knew that if he didn't act fast, everything he had built would come crashing down. Elias couldn't ignore it any longer. The feeling of being watched gnawed at him. He held a meeting with his gang that night in the dimly lit back room of the shop, the same place where so many had taken their last breaths. The men sat in a tense circle, waiting for Elias to speak. "There's someone watching us," he said, his voice cold and firm. "A man. Same spot, every night. He knows something." The men exchanged glances, their usual confidence wavering. Jonah leaned forward, his fingers tapping against the table. "You want us to take care of him?" Elias hesitated. Normally, the answer would be yes, eliminate the problem, like they always did. But something about this was different. The woman's final words echoed in his head. "You think no one knows?" Maybe she wasn't bluffing. Maybe someone had already been watching before she disappeared. If that was the case, removing the men might only make things worse. "Not yet," Elias finally said. "We watch him first. See what he does. If he makes a move, then we handle it." The gang nodded, though the unease in the room was thick. They had operated in the shadows for years, but now the shadows seemed to be closing in on them. The following nights were tense. Elias had Jonah and another man, Vincent, take shifts tailing the stranger. But every time they got close, he would slip away as if he knew he was being followed. It was unsettling. Then, one morning, as Elias arrived at the shop before dawn to begin preparing the day's meats, he found something that made his stomach twist. A single, bloodied note was pinned to the wooden door with a knife. "I know what you are. I know what you do." Elias ripped the note down, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. He scanned the street, but the morning fog made it impossible to see anything. He turned and stormed inside, slamming the door shut behind him. His gang arrived soon after, and he showed them the note. Jonah cursed under his breath, Vincent clenched his jaw, and the others looked at Elias, waiting for him to decide their next move. "We need to be ready," Elias growled. "If they're coming for us, we take them out first." For the first time in years, the gang prepared for war. They reinforced the shop, securing the back entrance, watching every customer who entered. Every night, the men took turns keeping watch, guns in hand, ready for anything. But days passed, then weeks, and nothing happened. No police. No more notes. The men watching from across the street had D. The tension remained, but Elias started to think maybe it had been a bluff. Maybe whoever it was had lost their nerve. Then, one evening, just as he was about to close up, the front door creaked open. A single man stepped inside. He wasn't particularly large or imposing, but something about him set Elias on edge. He had sharp, piercing eyes, and when he smiled, it was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Busy night?" the man asked casually, glancing around the shop. Elias forced a smile. "We're just closing up. If you need something, you'll have to come back tomorrow." The man nodded slowly, stepping further inside instead of leaving. "I was hoping to ask you something. About a woman. She came here a while ago. Asking about her brother." Elias felt the room shrink around him. His fingers curled slightly, ready to grab the knife resting on the counter. "A lot of people come in here," he said smoothly. "Hard to remember them all." The man chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, I think you'd remember this one." A long silence stretched between them. Elias could feel his men in the back room, listening, waiting. Finally, the man sighed. "You know, I've been watching this place for a while," he said. "And I have to say, it's impressive. The way you operate. The way people disappear, and yet your business only grows." He leaned on the counter, lowering his voice. "I know what you're doing, Elias." The butcher's grip tightened on the knife handle. "And who exactly are you?" The man smiled again. "Someone who doesn't scare easily." He reached into his coat, and for a brief second, Elias thought he was pulling a gun. Instead, he placed something on the counter. A badge. "Detective." Elias's blood ran cold. The man straightened. "You've been careful for years. I'll give you that. But you made a mistake." He tapped the badge with his finger. "That woman. The one you got rid of. She wasn't just some worried sister. She was an undercover investigator." The room felt suffocating. Elias's mind raced. If she had been a cop, that meant. "We have everything we need," the detective continued, as if reading his mind. "The disappearances. The connections. Your little operation. It's over." Elias knew then that he had only one choice. His fingers moved swiftly, grabbing the knife, swinging it toward the detective's throat. But the detective was faster. Before the blade could strike, a gun was already pointed at Elias's chest. The click of the safety being turned off echoed in the silent shop. "Don't," the detective said simply. At that moment, the front door burst open, and the shop was flooded with officers. Guns raised. Commands shouted. Elias's gang barely had time to react before they were forced to the ground, hands wrenched behind their backs. Elias stood frozen, the knife still in his grip, the weight of his downfall crushing him. The detective leaned in close, lowering his voice just enough for only Elias to hear. "You should have listened to her," he whispered. "She told you he knew." Elias let out a slow breath, then, for the first time in years, dropped the knife. The butcher shop had finally closed for good. As Elias dropped the knife, the weight of everything he had built came crashing down around him. The officers moved in swiftly, forcing him to the ground, his arms twisted behind his back as cold steel cuffs locked around his wrists. His gang, his loyal men who had helped him run the darkest business in the city, were already subdued, their faces pressed against the blood-stained floor of the shop. The detective, the men who had watched him for weeks, stood over him with an air of quiet victory. Elias lifted his head slightly, locking eyes with him. "You planned this," Elias muttered. The detective nodded. "We've been planning this for a long time. You just made it easier for us." Elias clenched his jaw, but he refused to show fear. "How long?" "Years," the detective admitted. "You were careful, I'll give you that. No bodies. No clear evidence. Just rumors, suspicions. But we knew. And then you got sloppy." The words cut deeper than any blade. Elias had always prided himself on being untouchable. He had run his business with precision, made sure there were no loose ends. But in the end, one mistake, a single miscalculation, had unraveled everything. The officers dragged him to his feet, shoving him toward the door. Outside, flashing red and blue lights bathed the marketplace in an eerie glow. A crowd had gathered, their faces a mix of shock and horror as they watched their beloved butcher, once praised for his delicious cuts of meat, being hauled away like a common criminal. The news spread quickly. By morning, every newspaper, every television channel, and every radio station carried the same story. Notorious butcher shop exposed as a house of horrors, human meat sold to unsuspecting customers. The city was in uproar. People who had once stood in line at Elias's shop, eager for his special cuts, now felt sick at the thought of what they had eaten. Investigators swarmed the shop, tearing it apart piece by piece. The hidden room in the back, the bloodstains scrubbed from the walls, the remnants of bones buried deep within the meat storage, all of it was uncovered. Elias and his men were thrown into separate holding cells, awaiting trial. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Witness testimonies, forensic findings, missing persons cases that now had gruesome answers, it all painted a picture of horror that even the most hardened criminals couldn't ignore. As Elias sat in his cold cell, staring at the cracked ceiling above him, he finally allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Not regret. Not guilt. Just the bitter realization that his empire had crumbled, and there was no coming. And yet, despite it all, a small smirk played at the corner of his lips. Because even as he awaited judgment, even as the world recoiled in disgust, Elias knew one thing for certain. Somewhere, in homes across the city, in the stomachs of those who had once worshipped his craft, his work still lived on. The trial of Elias and his gang became one of the most infamous cases in the city's history. The courtroom was packed every day, filled with reporters, horrified former customers, and the grieving families of the missing. The prosecution painted a brutal picture: how Elias had turned murder into a business, how he had preyed on the vulnerable, how his customers had unknowingly consumed the flesh of the dead. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses took the stand. Experts explained how human remains had been found in the meat sold at his shop. Forensic specialists detailed how his operation had been nearly perfect, how he had disposed of bones and belongings with surgical precision. But the most haunting testimonies came from the families of his victims. Mothers, fathers, siblings, people who had spent years searching for their loved ones, never knowing that they had been butchered, packaged, and fed to the unsuspecting masses. Their tears filled the courtroom, their grief undeniable. Elias sat through it all with an eerie calm. He listened to the accusations, the cries of rage, the threats shouted from the gallery. His gang members, once fearless, began to crack under pressure. One by one, they turned on him, cutting deals to save themselves, revealing gruesome details in exchange for lighter sentences. But Elias never spoke. Never defended himself. Never showed remorse. Then came the final day of the trial. The judge, a stern woman who had presided over countless cases, looked down at Elias with open disgust. "Elias Monroe," she said, her voice firm, "you have committed crimes so heinous, so devoid of humanity, that no punishment could truly equal the suffering you have caused. You are sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole." The gavel came down. The courtroom erupted in cheers, cries, and murmurs of relief. Elias simply smiled. As he was led out in chains, the detective who had caught him stood waiting by the exit. He leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "Was it worth it?" Elias turned his head slightly, his smile widening. "Every bite." The detective's face darkened, but he said nothing more as Elias was taken away. Prison. Life behind bars was supposed to be the end for Elias. A cage where he would rot, forgotten and powerless. But Elias was never one to be forgotten. In prison, he became something more than a murderer. He became a legend. Inmates whispered about him in hushed tones, some in fear, others in admiration. Guards avoided him when they could, unsettled by his unwavering stare, by the way he carried himself, not as a man defeated, but as a king in exile. And even in prison, Elias found a way to thrive. It started with the food. The prison meals were terrible: watery soup, stale bread, bland, lifeless meat. But Elias knew meat better than anyone. He knew what people craved, what they would do for something better. Slowly, Carefully, he built a network inside the prison. A few guards, desperate for extra cash, began sneaking in better ingredients. Inmates, hungry for something real, were willing to trade anything: favors, loyalty, protection. Elias became the supplier of something rare in that cold, concrete world. And then, one night, an opportunity presented itself. A prisoner went missing. A violent man, one no one would miss. Rumors spread that he had been transferred, but those who knew better, they whispered. And the next day, Elias's meals got better. The legend of the butcher lived on. Even in a cage, Elias continued his work. And somewhere, in the darkest corners of the prison, men feasted on flesh, never truly knowing what they were eating. Elias had lost his shop, his empire. But his business would never die. Years passed, but the legend of Elias Monroe, the butcher of the marketplace, never faded. Outside the prison walls, his story became an urban myth, whispered in dark corners and late-night conversations. Parents warned their children about the dangers of strangers. Former customers lived with the sickening realization of what they had eaten. And deep in the underworld, criminals studied his methods, trying to replicate his gruesome success. But inside the prison, Elias thrived. His network expanded, his influence growing in the shadows. Guards looked the other way, either too afraid or too greedy to interfere. Inmates came to him with desperate hunger, trading their loyalty for a taste of something forbidden. No one could ever prove it, of course. The missing inmates were officially recorded as transfers, fights gone wrong, suicides. But in the dead of night, when the air smelled of roasted meat and whispers traveled through the cell blocks, everyone knew the truth. Elias had lost his shop, but he had never lost his craft. One evening, as he sat in his dimly lit cell, a new guard arrived, a young recruit, fresh-faced and nervous. He had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. And now, standing before the man himself, he felt his skin crawl. Elias looked up from the book he was reading, his eyes sharp, his smile knowing. "First time on night duty?" he asked, his voice smooth as ever. The guard swallowed hard and nodded. Elias chuckled, setting the book down. He leaned forward slightly, his presence filling the small space between them. "Tell me, kid, do you like meat?" The guard took a step back, his breath hitching. Elias only smiled wider. And somewhere, in the depths of the prison, a pot boiled, a knife sharpened, and a new meal was prepared. The butcher's work was never done. Like and subscribe for more horrifying tales of the dark and twisted.